Hi, my name is Ross Hughes, and I'm a reference librarian at the Amelia Branch. I'm glad to have you with me today. This presentation is about the William H. Zimmer power plant, which is located in Moscow, Ohio. Did you know that it was intended to be a nuclear reactor? Perhaps you did, but regardless of whether you know the story or not, the Saga is an interesting episode from Clermont County's history. But before we get started with that, we'll need a brief history of nuclear power. In 1942, scientists working on the Manhattan Project created the world's first nuclear reactor, Chicago Pile 1. This reactor did not create power, but rather it was a proof of concept, showing that a nuclear reaction could be sustained and controlled. A few years later, in 1948, the X-10 reactor in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, powered a light bulb, showing the potential of nuclear as an energy source. This was followed in 1951 by the EBR, or Experimental Breeder Reactor 1, which provided light for its own facility. The 1950s were a time when anything seemed possible with the newfound power of the atom. While there was the specter of the world's annihilation in a nuclear war, there were also hopes that the atom could be harnessed to improve humanity's lot. Excited dreamers designed atomic cars, airplanes, and rockets. While these projects never yielded practical models, it shows that there was a widespread optimism about an atom-fueled future. In 1953, Dwight Eisenhower launched the Atoms for Peace program. In a speech given to the United Nations, he said, and I quote, "The United States knows that if the fearful trend of atomic military buildup can be reversed, this greatest of destructive forces can be developed into a great boon for the benefit of all mankind. The United States knows that peaceful power from atomic energy is no dream of the future. The capability, already proved, is here today. Who can doubt that if the entire body of the world's scientists and engineers had adequate amounts of fissionable material with which to test and develop their ideas, this capability would rapidly be transformed into universal, efficient, economic usage." Unquote. In this speech, he also suggested creating an organization to oversee a stockpile of these fissionable materials, and each one of the nuclear powers would would contribute some to the stockpile, and that would be held in kind. In response to Eisenhower's speech and other pressures, the International Atomic Energy Agency, or also known as the IAEA, was created in 1957, although Eisenhower's idea of a joint stockpile never came to fruition. In 1954, a year after Eisenhower gave his speech, an experimental nuclear reactor was completed in Obninsk, USSR. The reactor was referred to as Atomirny. My apologies to Russian speakers, but it means peaceful atom. At any rate, this reactor was the first to be part of a power grid. And then 2 years later, in 1956, the Calder Hall Nuclear Station, which is located in the United Kingdom, became the world's first commercial power plant. The U.S. built its first commercial reactor in 1958 with the completion of the Shippingport, Pennsylvania Atomic Power Station. Progress was also being made in reactor design. Throughout the late 50s and early 60s, General Electric developed the boiling water, or BWR, reactor. More about how that works in a few minutes. With so many leaps and bounds being made, It is understandable why so many believe that nuclear would supplant conventional sources of power. An article in the Cincinnati Enquirer estimated that nuclear, quote, will produce electrical power by the end of the 1970s in well over half of the nation's 50 states, unquote. 150 reactors were expected to be in operation by 1980, and, again, I quote, as many as 1,000 supersized reactors might be operating by the year 2000, unquote. On September the 13th, 1969, the Cincinnati Enquirer announced that there were plans to build a nuclear power plant in Moscow, Ohio. This was to be a tripartite venture by Cincinnati Gas and Electric, which henceforth will be referred to as CG&E, Columbus and Southern Ohio Electric, and Dayton Power and Light. CG&E would handle the day-to-day operations of the plant. The director of CG&E, William H. Zimmer, stated that nuclear would, quote, produce more economical power than the conventional coal-powered means, and will help us put a brake on ever-increasing costs in labor, equipment, and fuel, unquote. While he was forthright about the fact that this wouldn't reduce energy costs, Zimmer believed that a nuclear power plant would keep costs at present levels, although that could not be for certain. It was also expected that the Cincinnati, southwestern Ohio area would double its energy needs during the 1970s due to population growth and migration for work. A campaign was planned to address public concerns about nuclear while explaining its numerous benefits. Power company reps said at the unveiling of the project that there would be no health hazards and that due attention had been paid to ecological planning. In fact, they said a nuclear plant had the potential to reduce environmental pollution compared to fossil fuels. The plant would consist of 2 reactors. The first would come online in January 1975. The date of the second reactor's completion was not mentioned in the unveiling of the project, but later articles in the Enquirer said that the completion of that reactor was scheduled for 1976. However, these plans were put on hold in November 1970, pending exploration of energy needs forecasts and future technology by each company involved in the project. At any rate, total cost of the plant was estimated to be $480 million, and it would produce 840,000 kilowatts of power. Work could not begin until the Atomic Energy Commission, the AEC, gave its approval, which was expected to occur in April 1971. On April 6, 1970, the application, consisting of a short report and 5 volumes of data, each 4 inches thick, was presented to the AEC. While approval was pending, work got underway in preparing the site. However, approval from the AEC was not forthcoming. In September 1971, it halted further work on the power plant. The AEC had been found negligent in its process of plant inspections and course-corrected to have stricter standards. As a result, CG&E would have to complete a more thorough cost-benefit analysis, as well as a report on the effect the plant would have on the environment. It was estimated that the delay would cost $15 million. Now, before we go any further into the history of the Zimmer power plant, I think it's important to understand how nuclear power works. And this is not as mysterious as it seems. Everything that possesses matter is made of atoms. While atoms are not the smallest things in the universe, they are the smallest components of chemical elements. At the center of the atom is the nucleus, which is composed of 2 particles, protons, which are positively charged, and neutrons, which lack a charge. Orbiting on the outside of the atom are electrons, which are negatively charged. The number of protons determines what element the atom is. This is called, cleverly enough, the atomic number. So, for example, the hydrogen only possesses one proton and thus has an atomic number of 1. An atom of a particular element can vary in the number of electrons it has. These variations are called ions, but they really aren't that important in this discussion. What we are most interested in are isotopes, elements where the number of neutrons varies from that of protons. And as an aside, most stable elements, have a nearly equal number of protons and neutrons in their nucleus. Isotopes make for unstable atoms. Atoms want to shed the excess neutrons and return to stasis. When neutrons collide with neutrons in the atom of an isotope, say uranium-235, where 235 is the number of neutrons in its nucleus, energy is released along with more neutrons. This process is called fission, and this is what powers the nuclear reactor. If the neutrons then collide with another U-235 atom, and those collide with another, and so on, a chain reaction begins, which can be self-sustaining if properly controlled. A tremendous amount of energy is released, which then can be harnessed to create electricity. And you get the idea of how it's a chain reaction from this illustration on the right. Think of it as a kind of neutron dance. A nuclear reactor initiates and controls the fission process. In a boiling water reactor like that planned for Zimmer, water is pumped into the reactor vessel. This is where the fuel is located. Water is channeled past the fuel and acts as a moderator, which slows down the neutrons coming from the fuel rods of U-235, or uranium-235. This makes fission and a chain reaction possible. If the reactor lacked a moderator, the neutrons would likely just zip past each other without colliding. Control rods, also in the reactor vessel, are made of neutron-absorbing materials and act as a kind of throttle on the reaction. These rods are located around the fuel. In case of an emergency, they can be lowered to stop the reaction altogether. The containment vessel, which surrounds the reactor, also prevents radiation from being released in the case of a meltdown. As the reaction continues, the water becomes heated by the energy released by fission. This heated water turns to steam, which in turn pushes turbines that generate electric power. The steam then condenses and the water is returned back to the feed pump, and then the process repeats itself. This is a very, very basic explanation of a nuclear reactor, and I'm certain quite a bit simplistic. But if anything I say is inaccurate, I can only claim ignorance, because after all, I'm a librarian and not a physicist. But anyhow, let us return to the narrative. One major concern was that growing population and industry demanded more energy, and that conventional sources could not fulfill that need. According to the Inquirer, electrical energy needs rose by 400% between the years 1950 and 1968. The result would be the need to double electrical output every decade. However, it was supposed that this growth could not go on forever, and I quote, talk that it might make some people shudder, unquote. Supernuclear power plants, which could generate 1,000 megawatts, were considered to be the solution. Zimmer's expected output was slightly below this goal at 840 megawatts. In March 1972, Clermont County Commissioners noted that, quote, the county, like our nation, is approaching the time when adequate electrical power will not be available to meet the needs, unquote. These worries were exacerbated by the 1973 fuel crisis, when the OPEC cartel placed an oil embargo on countries that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Even though there were oil and gas shortages throughout the 1970s, legitimate worries about the safety of nuclear power remained. It wasn't seen as a cure-all, in other words. Now, many of these concerns dovetailed with the growing environmental movement. As aforementioned, supporters of the nuclear plant attempted to assuage the public's fears by an information campaign, public meetings. There are plenty of articles in the Cincinnati Enquirer and the Clermont Sun as well that answered questions about how the nuclear power plant would work, what risks there are, etc. And any of these meetings will talk about the benefits and the safety measures that CG&E was taking to complete the plant. On May the 20th, 1972, Zimmer was given the go-ahead to submit an environmental impact statement to the AEC. A public meeting was to discuss this took place on June the 1st. However, foes of the plant were excluded. Dr. Fankhauser, pictured here on the right, one of the plant's most vocal opponents, believed that the meeting was merely a rubber stamp. The AC had been under a lot of scrutiny, I might add. He noted that the AEC's acceptable levels for radiation for the plant were too high. And as a result, genetic damage to those living around the plant would cause birth defects, decreased intelligence, deaths in utero, and in early childhood. Another opponent of Zimmer, Mrs. Nancy Fichter of New Richmond, said that the plant ought to be built in downtown Cincinnati, next to Riverfront Stadium. Nevertheless, the impact statement was completed in September. On October the 21st, the AEC gave its final approval. Construction could now begin. A photo from the November 22, 1972 edition of the Clermont Sun shows concrete being poured for the floor of the turbine room. Meanwhile, the cost of Zimmer continued to climb even as the project was put on hold. A report in January 1972 from the Enquirer noted that $27 million had already been spent. An August article in the Clermont Sun reported that the AEC estimated that further delays will cost $32 million, and those costs would ultimately need to be paid by customers. That's actually directly from the Sun. Subsequent rate hikes throughout the 1970s, partially due to the cost of Zimmer, infuriated some of CG&E's customers who already questioned the utility of building a nuclear power plant. Here are some photographs that were featured in local newspapers which tracked the progress of the power plant. In spite of challenges, work continued. In November of 1975, 5 petitions were presented to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, henceforth referred to as the NRC, regarding the safety of the Zimmer plant. Now, the NRC had taken on the AEC's role following a series of controversies surrounding that department, which led to it being disbanded in January of 1975. That said, the petitions that were from November of that year came from the city of Cincinnati, Miami Valley Power Project, and several Clermont County residents, including Dr. Fankhauser. The Enquirer noted that the issues raised by critics involved radiation monitoring, plans to protect the public in case of a radiation accident or disaster, whether Dayton Power and Light needs the additional power Zimmer will produce, and whether municipalities drawing on water supplies affected by Zimmer radiation should bear the costs of taking that pollution out of the water. It was suggested that there be limitations to the amount of spent fuel stored at Zimmer. Furthermore, petitioners noted the lack of a comprehensive evacuation plan, which at that point was to call county disaster services, which was then to call the sheriff. As Dr. Fankhauser's attorney said, "I hope the sheriff has a loud voice." CG&E countered that these plans were in the works and were not in their purview. Rather, it was up to the police and emergency services, the locality, and the state to determine how best to protect citizens if a nuclear disaster were to occur. At any rate, these petitions were also presented to the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board in January of 1976. The Cincinnati Enquirer reported that spokesmen for the utilities rejected each complaint, saying that Zimmer meets Nuclear Regulatory Commission requirements appropriate to its current construction, and it is not up to the Safety and Licensing Board to order utilities to go beyond those regulations in order to win the operating license. Nevertheless, the NRC gave the okay for the petitions to be considered by the Atomic Safety and Licensing Board in late January 1976. Another major blow came in February 1976. Victor Griffin, an engineer, resigned from his position with Kaiser, who had been contracted to construct the plant. He charged that pumps, valves, and other equipment were not properly inspected, and that the NRC's standards were not strict enough. Griffin already had a bad opinion of nuclear power prior to the construction of Zimmer. He simply did not believe it was safe. The Enquirer reported that, and I quote here, "asking if a malfunction in any of the materials purchased by CG&E could cause a major accident." Griffin, replied, "Yes, definitely." Furthermore, 3 nuclear specialists at Zimmer in the employ of General Electric quit, explaining their opposition to atomic power, calling it, quote, "a monster that threatens all future generations," unquote. One of these engineers cited a fundamental flaw in the coolant system that could lead to a meltdown. As a result of the resignations and Griffin's complaint, the NRC undertook a surprise inspection of Zimmer. In September 1976, there were further accusations of faulty parts being used in the plant's construction. The NRC once again sent agents to Zimmer, this time to speak with the workers. When the immense destructive power of the atom was discovered, it was immediately harnessed for warfare. The earliest reactors were used to create fissile material to be used in bombs. The destruction unleashed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki would forever change the world. These attacks would fuel fears of a worldwide nuclear holocaust, as tensions between the US and USSR led to the Cold War. Perhaps it should be no surprise, then, that nuclear power had such vocal opposition, and perhaps rightly so. I'm not here to make judgments on the matter, but the specter of doom seemed to haunt anything nuclear. Attempts to educate the public could not get rid of the nagging worry that it was an unpredictable, harmful, and possibly fatal power source. The atomic optimism that had been so prevalent throughout the 1950s had turned to skepticism by the late 60s and 70s. Support for the nuclear power plant amongst the population of the county was mixed. Early on, there was the prospect of tax revenue for the village of Moscow, which annexed the land on which the plant was built. Furthermore, there were hopes that it could alleviate unemployment by providing new jobs. Although investigation of the plant had gone on for some time, the NRC had not discovered any widespread negligence or malfeasance on the part of CG&E or anybody who'd been contracted to build the plant. As the 70s continued, however, public support for the Zimmer plant began to slowly decline. Continued delays in building brought into question the overall safety of the plant, while also contributing to rate hikes. Meanwhile, protests and marches in the vicinity of the construction area brought publicity to the anti-nuclear cause. Organizations such as CARE, Citizens Against a Radioactive Environment, gained notoriety for their activism, including 2 of its members being arrested and attracting the attention of Ralph Nader, who had planned to join a protest in November of 1978 but could not make it at the last moment. On March the 28th, 1979, the Advisory Committee on Reactor Safeguards deemed the Zimmer project could be operated without undue risk to the health and safety of the public. That's a quote from them. Operating license hearings could now begin. Early in the morning on that very same day, reactor number 2 of the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station outside of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, had a partial meltdown. Some radioactive gases were vented into the environment, but it was determined that this only added a minimal amount to the total background radiation. However, cleanup would take until the early 1990s and cost nearly $1 billion. By this point, companies that had invested in nuclear power plants were facing compounding costs and a vocal opposition. The 3 Mile Island accident only brought more scrutiny to bear on the atomic industry. Another factor contributing to the decline of nuclear power in the United States was an effort by the Carter and subsequent administrations to exploit this country's other energy resources. This need was considered especially pressing amidst the energy crises of the 1970s. In a speech given to the nation on July the 15th, 1979, President Carter encouraged, quote, energy security, the most massive peacetime commitment of funds and resources in our nation's history to develop America's own alternative sources of fuel, from coal, from oil shale, from plant products for gasohol, from unconventional gas, from the sun, unquote. Nuclear was conspicuously left unmentioned. After 1978 and up until 2012, there were no new authorizations for nuclear power plants. By 1983, over 100 planned plants were canceled. Zimmer was soon to join that list. This advertisement by Exxon gives an idea of the changing attitudes toward energy production that happened as a result of the fuel crises of the 1970s. The approach given here is akin to to the one that is outlined in Carter's speech. This opinion piece, which comes from the Clermont Sun in early 1976, shows that while this by no means shows that Zimmer had wide support, it does show that nuclear was considered to be benign at that point, and that CG&E safety measures were considered thorough by some. Let's contrast that with a similar article that appeared in the Sun after the 3 Mile Island incident. Note that 2 of the respondents have a general unease about the continued work at Zimmer in light of that meltdown. Opponents gained more traction as a result of the 3 Mile Island accident. Here is a page-long advertisement published a year after the disaster. It was from organizations that want to put an end to the nuclear project at Zimmer. Coal is offered as a reliable alternative to nuclear. And as far as I know, this is the earliest mention of conversion to coal. Hearings to seek an operating license for Zimmer began in June 1979. Meanwhile, Thomas Applegate, a private detective, was tasked with spying on someone who was in the divorce case, who also worked at Zimmer. Adopting the name Tom Jackson, he posed as a cost accounting engineer. His investigation soon took a shocking turn. In the month that he was working as the cost accounting engineer, Applegate found instances in which contractors falsified time cards. One pastime amongst the workers was making belt buckles out of nuclear-grade iron that was intended to be used for construction. Furthermore, and I quote here, workers commonly snuck out of work to drink at local bars. With regard to one particular worker, Applegate analyzed that $3,517.46 of this man's monthly salary, and this is Applegate's saying this here, the man's monthly salary was totally wasted. Unquote. Worse yet, documents about faulty pipes were altered to make it look like there weren't any problems with it. So according to Applegate, the bottom line is the pipe is defective and it was installed in the plant. Initially, CG&E encouraged Applegate to continue his investigation when he first reported it and brought him into their employ. However, that relationship quickly soured. The private detective felt that CG&E was overlooking or ignoring what he was reporting back to them. Earl Borgman, the vice president of CG&E, said that Applegate had and quote here, vendetta, because he was no longer on their payroll. In the expose article that was featured in the Cincinnati Enquirer on April the 20th, 1980, Borgman contended that the pipes were not defective and they had been x-rayed to prove it. At the beginning of May, the NRC gave its support for the veracity of CG&E's claims. Finally, Borgman downplayed reports of buckle making and on-the-clock drinking. The investigator was simply picking up hearsay. Throughout the year of 1980, pressure built on the NRC to take action. In March 1981, the Enquirer reported that 10 members of the NRC had also joined Applegate in their accusations. At first, they charged Zimmer with 2 infractions. 3 pipes used for construction weren't tested, and these were not tagged as possibly faulty and requiring an X-ray. In May, the NRC decided to restart the probe as they found the first probe to have been inadequate. This new investigation began in November of 1981. The findings would lead to a $300,000 fine for CG&E. Beginning in June 1982, the issues surrounding the Zimmer plant were heard by the House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs. Henry Myers, chief scientific advisor to the group, and here I'm quoting from another book about this, Henry Myers could hold forth on many of these cases, guiding his listeners on a virtual tour of a nuclear hell's kitchen, where cracks, leaks, faulty welds, false records, and human vice made an unsettling portrait of reactor sites in the United States. Myers later recalled about the case that he said, "This is the one where there were an overabundance of workers and purportedly 3 trailers on the site, one for drinking, one for gambling, and one for prostitution." He also recalled that an NRC official told a colleague to take any of the paperwork that was related to faulty welding with the pipes home so that it could not be requested under the Freedom of Information Act. Despite the evidence presented by Applegate and others, work continued. However, it was becoming more and more obvious that the final cost of the plant was going to be far higher than anyone had expected. Continued delays for inspections were having an effect on the final price tag. A July 1979 estimate placed the cost at $850 million. And then less than a year later, in April 1980, that estimate had risen to $1 billion. By late 1983, independent investigators placed the final figure at $3.5 billion. And then the NRC also found itself in hot water. It was accused of being biased in favor of the nuclear industry and of sweeping major problems under the rug, while limiting access to nuclear sites to outside investigators. On January the 22nd, 1984, CG&E announced plans to convert the plant to coal power. At first, Director William Dickhoner had expressed doubts about the viability of such a switch, even going so far as to state in the previous month that, quote, it would not be feasible to convert the plant to a coal-fired facility because of the lack of space for coal storage and incompatibility of equipment, unquote. The William H. Zimmer nuclear power plant was 97% complete. The conversion to coal was expected to be finished in 1990. After litigation, which we will not cover here, work began in 1987. It then opened as a coal power plant in 1991. In September of last year, 2020, plans were announced to decommission Zimmer by 2027. And here's another one of those opinion pieces that was published on the same day of the announcement of Zimmer's conversion to coal. It's kind of interesting because all of the people that had been asked about their opinion are pretty well against it, or rather, pretty well against it being a nuclear power plant, and glad that it's being converted to coal. And here's a picture that portends the future of the Zimmer plant as a coal barge is breaking through the ice on the Ohio River, right across from the Zimmer plant. And the picture was taken again for the January 22nd, 1984 edition of the Cincinnati Enquirer. All right, so a few final thoughts. The saga of the William H. Zimmer nuclear power plant, then coal power plant, is a convoluted one. For the sake of brevity and not to burden you all with too many minute details, I've given only a general outline of the course of its history. So, unfortunately, some things had to be omitted, but I think I've covered all the major points. The story of Zimmer is one that mirrors general trends in American attitudes to nuclear power from the 60s until the 80s. It is one that began with hopes for the triumph of the atom, but ended with fears of environmental degradation and destruction. It also demonstrates the difficulties that new technologies face in their development. The power of the atom was, in a sense, not fully realized, or perhaps it would be better to say that the peaceful power of the atom and its attendant risks were not completely understood. Government regulations on the nuclear industry became more all-encompassing throughout the 70s as more threats to nuclear safety were discovered. So as a result, power companies like CG&E had to delay their construction in order to meet the specifications, which in turn got them to go ahead from the NRC on many occasions. But despite all this, the public still had concerns. And those concerns cannot be dismissed. What Applegate discovered going on at the construction site only furthered the narrative that the plant would never be safe due to human error, corner cutting, and negligence. And there would always be a shadow of doubt, even when the construction was warranted as safe. Thank you for watching. As always, I greatly appreciate it. I hope that I have both entertained and informed you. If you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me at the number or email listed below. Or you can post those questions to Facebook in the comment section. I'll try to answer those questions as soon as possible. At any rate, here are a list of resources I found to be of use and interest when writing this program. Ancestry, of course, is I always suggest, is the premier genealogical database. This is only available in library branches. However, there are other genealogical databases that you can use from home. You just need to have a library card. And these databases are Heritage, Quest, and Fold 3 military records that can be used for genealogy. The brunt of the research for this program utilizes ProQuest's historical newspaper database of the Cincinnati Enquirer, which is available through our website. It's a treasure trove for the curious. Even if you're not doing research, it's just kind of fun to browse around. You might also be interested in reading the book Command and Control by Eric Schlosser. It details an atomic near miss while explaining the history of our nuclear weapons and the potential for something to go wrong. The other book that I thought-provoking was Midnight in Chernobyl. It's a masterful work about the 1986 nuclear disaster. I listened to the audiobook and the narrator was great. There's also the HBO series Chernobyl, which is available through the library. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish you very well.